The wagon wheels shattered against the concealed boulder with a sound like a rifle shot, and Adelaide felt the entire bed lurch violently beneath her feet. Her bound wrists jerked hard against the splintering rail, rough hemp rope slicing through skin deep enough to draw blood. For one suspended heartbeat that seemed to stretch into eternity, the world tilted at an impossible angle. Her head swung out over 30 feet of empty air, the ravine below yawning wide with jagged stones and skeletal brush waiting to shatter bone. The other women screamed, their voices raw with animal terror. The rope binding Adelaide to the wagon rail groaned ominously, individual fibers separating strand by strand under her weight. She tried desperately to pull herself back toward safety, every muscle straining to its limit, but the wagon lurched again with a sickening crack of stressed timber. The rail she clung to splintered under her full weight, sharp wooden shards biting deep into her palms. Then thunder erupted from the wheat field flanking the rutted road. A rider burst through the golden stalks at full gallop, his pony's muscular chest parting the grain like rapids splitting around stone. He leaned so far from the saddle that his shoulder nearly brushed the horse's straining neck, one arm extending in a smooth, practiced arc, born of years riding this unforgiving terrain. His hand locked around Adelaide's waist with a grip like forged iron, and he hauled her bodily off the collapsing wagon bed with strength that seemed impossible. The impact drove every molecule of air from her lungs. She slammed against his chest hard enough to feel his ribs through the rough fabric of his shirt, hard enough to leave bruises that would ache for days. The world spun in a dizzying blur, sky, earth, wheat, choking dust, all bleeding together. Behind her, the wagon skidded sideways, with a tortured shriek of wood grinding against unforgiving stone. Women tumbled against one another in a tangle of limbs and roped their panicked screams, cutting through the dusty air. The horses screamed and kicked their eyes, rolling white with terror. But somehow, through luck or the grace of something unseen, the wagon held at the ravine's crumbling edge, tilted at a sickening angle over absolute nothingness. Adelaide hung across the rider's saddle like a sack of grain, gasping desperately for air. Her heart hammering so violently, she thought her ribs might crack from the internal pressure. He held her steady with one powerful arm, while his other hand controlled the dancing pony with expert precision. The horse snorted and sidestepped nervously, ears pinned flat against its skull, nostrils flaring wide. She twisted enough to glimpse his face through the settling dust, sharp cheekbones carved by relentless sun and wind, dark eyes that flicked from her to the road ahead. With tactical calculation, long black hair tied back with a strip of weathered leather. Apache. She recognized the look from her months in Coyote Springs, the way soldiers watched such men at the fort with barely concealed hostility, the way townspeople gave them wide berth in the street, as if danger might be contagious. On the road behind them, a thick-necked man on a lathered horse bellowed with authority born of violence. "Careful with that one, you damned fool. The boss paid good silver for her contract." The foreman, Haskell. Adelaide knew his name all too well, spurred his mount closer, yanking the reins so brutally, his horse threw its head back, and foam flew from the bit in white streaks. "No one marries a black girl, sir." Haskell shouted, his voice dripping with the casual cruelty that came from years of wielding power over the powerless. "She's just here to birth babies. Pike wants her delivered in one piece, not dead at the bottom of some godforsaken ditch." The Apache rider's jaw tightened visibly, a muscle jumping near his temple like a storm warning. He looked down at Adelaide, and their eyes locked for one brief, electric moment that seemed to contain entire conversations. She saw something flicker in his dark gaze, anger certainly, but also recognition of a shared condition she could not yet name, a kinship forged in the fires of being considered less than human. Then he wheeled his pony away, without uttering a single word, cutting back through the wheat field with the same sudden violence he had arrived with. The tall stalks whipped closed behind him, like a stage curtain dropping, swallowing him completely. as if he had never existed. Adelaide sagged against the wagon rail as Haskell and two other riders dragged the listing vehicle back from the precipice, cursing viciously and sweating in the afternoon heat. Her wrists burned where the rope had torn skin raw. Her throat felt lined with sandpaper too parched for speech. But she could still feel the ghost of that strong arm around her waist, the unthinking strength in it, the way he had not hesitated even for a single heartbeat before risking his own life. She did not know his name. She did not know if their paths would ever cross again in this harsh, indifferent wilderness. But she knew with absolute certainty that she would remember his eyes and the way he had looked at her, as if she was worth saving. Coyote Springs squatted on the high prairie like a festering wound that refused to heal properly. One main street ran through its core, flanked by false front buildings that pretended to architectural ambitions their warped, sun-bleached lumber could never support. The saloon, the general store with its perpetually dusty windows, the livery stable emanating the persistent smell of manure and rotting hay, the telegraph office with its thin wire humming overhead, connecting this raw settlement to civilization somewhere far beyond the endless horizon. All the structures leaned slightly southward, as if decades of relentless wind had spent patient years trying to push them over, and had not quite succeeded yet, but would eventually triumph. Dust covered everything with democratic impartiality, settling on windowsills in miniature drifts, clinging to wagon wheels in thick crusts, coating men's hats and women's skirts, until the entire town wore the same dull brown uniform of defeat. When wind rose, and it rose often with vicious intensity, clouds of grit transformed the air into something you chewed as much as breathed, filling mouths with the taste of ancient earth and broken dreams. Above the town, dominating the landscape like a malignant tumor, loomed Widow's Peak. The gold mine's dark mouth gaped in the hillside, a wound in the earth that would not close. And the constant percussion of hammers and blasting powder echoed down into the settlement at all hours, a reminder of who controlled everything. Antonin Pike owned the mine. He owned the Red Cattle, the biggest and rowdiest saloon. He owned half the freight wagons that rolled through town on their way to somewhere more promising. He owned most of the men's debts, their mortgages, their dignity, their very futures. Some whispered he owned Sheriff McCready too, though the sheriff liked to pretend otherwise when he was sober enough to care about maintaining appearances. Adelaide had journeyed west in the spring, following the war's end, chasing whispered promises of freedom and opportunity. The recruiters in Memphis had spoken with practiced eloquence about land grants available to freedmen, about work that paid honest wages in real currency, about frontier towns where a skilled woman could build an actual life with her own two hands and her own labor. Those smooth-talking recruiters had conveniently neglected to mention Antonin Pike. They had said absolutely nothing about labor contracts, written in dense legal language she could not parse despite her best efforts, about stacked fees that multiplied faster than any human being could possibly earn, or about the way Pike's hired men watched her and the other women like wolves studying a flock of sheep, always calculating, always threatening. She slept in the cramped corner of a laundry shed behind the Red Cattle Saloon, sharing the inadequate space with 3 other women trapped in similar circumstances. The floor was packed dirt that transformed into slick mud when rain found the inevitable gaps in the warped walls. The roof leaked persistently. At night, rats scratched behind the thin boards with industrious persistence, and Adelaide lay awake, listening to their movements, too bone-deep exhausted to muster genuine fear. Every morning, well before the sun crested the eastern hills, she walked miles across open grassland to deliver babies in sod huts and lean to cabins scattered like dice thrown carelessly across the endless prairie. The work was brutally hard, the compensation meager at best, and fully half her paltry earnings went straight back to Pike for nebulous charges labeled vaguely as room and board. But Adelaide was genuinely exceptional at her trade. Better than exceptional, she possessed a gift born of generations. She had learned midwifery from her grandmother, who had learned from her own mother before her, an unbroken chain of knowledge passed down through hands that possessed no other form of power in a world systematically determined to crush them into nothing. Adelaide knew instinctively how to turn a breech baby with fingers that could read flesh like other people read printed text. She knew precisely how to stanch catastrophic hemorrhaging with pressure applied in exactly the right location at exactly the right moment. She knew how to keep a laboring woman calm when unbearable pain threatened to turn her mind feral with panic and desperation. She had pulled more women back from death's grasping threshold than any circuit-riding preacher in 3 counties had saved with prayer. Though nobody spoke this truth aloud, where it might actually matter or threaten the established order. One afternoon in late September, a dust storm rolled across the prairie like divine wrath made manifest. The sky transformed from brilliant blue to sickly yellow-brown, to a bruised black that swallowed the sun completely. Wind shrieked through Coyote Springs with fury, ripping shingles from roofs and sending empty barrels tumbling down the street like children's toys. Adelaide was miles out at the Johansson homestead when the storm struck with full force a sagging sod structure with walls so thin she could watch precious daylight leak through 100 different cracks. Mrs. Johansson was 19 years old, pale as fresh milk and laboring with the kind of dangerous difficulty that killed women regularly on the frontier. The baby presented breech feet first. Adelaide could feel the terrible positioning through the grotesquely swollen belly, a death sentence for both mother and infant, if she could not somehow coax the stubborn child into proper position. Outside, the storm battered the fragile walls with fists of wind and choking grit. Inside, the air thickened until everyone coughed continuously, dust coating tongues and teeth with the taste of dirt. The roof timbers creaked with a sound like slow torture, threatening to peel away completely and expose them all to the storm's full murderous fury. Adelaide braced one hand firmly against the rough plank wall to anchor herself against the building's violent shaking. With her other hand, she worked carefully inside Mrs. Johansson's fingers, searching with deliberate precision, pressing, urging, trying with all her skill to coax the stubborn infant into cooperation with nature's design. The young woman screamed and thrashed violently against the unbearable pain. And her husband, barely 20 himself, with a downy beard that had never known a proper razor, held her shoulders with trembling arms and wept openly like a frightened child. "Hold her absolutely still," Adelaide commanded sharply, her voice cutting through the storm's howl with surgical precision. "If she moves even slightly now, I lose the baby. Possibly both of them." The terrified boy obeyed immediately, his arms trembling with effort and raw terror. Adelaide closed her eyes and surrendered completely to the ancient wisdom residing in her trained hands. She felt the baby shift grudgingly, just a fraction of an inch. She pressed harder, angling her palm with millimeter precision earned through hundreds of difficult births, and suddenly the child rotated properly. The head slipped down where nature had always intended it to go, and Mrs. Johansson sobbed with relief so profound it sounded remarkably like grief transformed. 20 agonizing minutes later, the baby finally slid into Adelaide's waiting hands, slick with blood, and Vernix squalling with pure outrage at being born into a world of dust and violent wind. The roof gave one final apocalyptic groan, but miraculously held together. Mrs. Johansson collapsed back against the sweat-soaked blankets, gasping desperately for air. Her husband buried his face in her damp hair and made sounds no language could adequately capture. Adelaide methodically cleaned the infant with water from a clay jug, wrapped the tiny fragile body in a threadbare blanket worn soft from years of hard use, and placed the child carefully on its mother's chest. Nobody said thank you. Nobody met her eyes with gratitude or genuine acknowledgement of what she had just accomplished. When Adelaide finally staggered out into the dying storm an hour later, Her dress soaked completely through with sweat and blood, her eyes burning from accumulated grit, every muscle screaming in protest. The young husband muttered only, "I'll inform Pike you fulfilled your contractual obligation." That was the complete entirety of her compensation. Cold words utterly devoid of warmth or human feeling. She walked back toward Coyote Springs, through the settling dust alone with the ceaseless wind and her bitter thoughts. In town, Adelaide shared the cramped laundry shed with two other women trapped in Pike's intricate web of exploitation. Clara cooked at the Red Cattle and had developed a persistent cough that would not quit, a wet rattling sound that kept everyone awake through long nights. Lisa scrubbed floors with silent, methodical dedication and spoke so rarely that Adelaide sometimes forgot she existed until she glimpsed unexpected movement in the corner shadows. All three were bound to Pike by contracts they had signed in desperation, or been systematically deceived into signing all promised reasonable wages that somehow never quite materialized after the various mysterious fees and charges were carefully tallied, all trapped by accumulating debt that grew faster than any human being could possibly hope to earn through honest labor. But Adelaide was not entirely isolated in her daily struggle for survival. Dr. Edmund Lysander maintained a medical office above the general store. A narrow room with shelves crowded with brown glass bottles bearing elaborate Latin labels and a scarred desk buried under medical journals shipped at great expense from Boston and Philadelphia. Edmund treated whoever presented themselves at his door regardless of their color or their capacity to pay in currency, and he quietly resented Pike's stranglehold on the entire settlement with the kind of cold, patient anger that burns steadiest and longest. Adelaide had worked alongside him twice once to set a compound fracture that had broken completely through skin in a ranching accident, and once to carefully stitch a vicious knife wound on a ranch hand who adamantly refused to visit the fort surgeon for reasons he declined to explain to anyone. Edmund was methodical, careful, and kind in a manner that initially made Adelaide deeply suspicious of his motives. Kindness in Coyote Springs usually arrived with hidden price tags and unspoken expectations that came due without warning. But Edmund never demanded anything beyond fair compensation for her genuinely skilled assistance. He paid her in silver coins that she carefully secreted in a small tin buried beneath her thin mattress. When Pike's foreman came sniffing around one afternoon demanding to know why Edmund was deliberately undermining the established labor system, the doctor simply observed with clinical detachment that he required competent medical assistance, and Pike's contract contained absolutely no clause forbidding such arrangements. The foreman departed with visible reluctance, but Adelaide knew with bone-deep certainty that this would not be the final confrontation on the subject. She also occasionally crossed paths with Quincy Hale, though she honestly wished circumstances allowed her to avoid him entirely. Quincy was a professional gambler and a hired gun when the cards ran cold, lanky quick, with a self-deprecating joke and apparently utterly devoid of anything resembling consistent moral principle. He had lost catastrophically at Pike's transparently rigged card table one whiskey-soaked night, and awakened the following morning to discover himself deeply in Pike's debt, branded as surely as any branded ox. Now he ran errands for Pike-intimidated debtors with casual threats, and cultivated strategic blindness when Pike's men dragged people into back rooms for private conversations that left them bloodied and terrified. Adelaide had encountered Quincy outside the saloon one evening, counting coins with an expression of profound self-disgust etched across his weathered face. Their eyes met briefly in the fading light. He tipped his hat with exaggerated mocking courtesy and continued walking without speaking. She did not trust him, would have been an absolute fool to trust him, but she did not quite hate him either, with the pure hatred she reserved for Pike and Haskell. He was simply another damaged soul caught in Pike's grinding machinery, being slowly crushed along until something essential inside him finally broke completely. Above them all, watching from the military fort 2 miles north with the infinite patience of a hunting cat, sat Captain Abram Cole. He embodied army discipline in every ramrod straight inch of his imposing posture. Cold blue eyes that constantly calculated angles and trajectories, a jaw that looked carved from solid granite boots polished to a mirror, shine even in this perpetually dust-choked wilderness. He commanded a small detachment tasked with maintaining fragile peace between white settlers and the Apache bands that still hunted in the surrounding hills and valleys, living on land their ancestors had occupied for centuries. But peace, in Captain Cole's personal lexicon, meant absolute submission, preferably total. He wanted the Apache confined to distant reservations or dead and buried, and he observed Pike's steadily expanding influence with the calculating patience of a career military man who recognized opportunity hiding within other people's suffering and conflict. Adelaide did not yet comprehend any of this larger, more complex game being played. She knew only that when she walked through town on her various errands, soldiers stationed at the fort gates watched her with eyes that held absolutely no kindness whatsoever, only cold assessment. The Apache scout who had torn her from the collapsing wagon bore the name Mahka, though Adelaide would not learn this crucial detail until circumstances forced them into much closer proximity. She did not yet know he worked as a civilian scout for Captain Cole, riding many miles ahead of military patrols to track game and interpret the subtle language written in bent grass and disturbed soil that spoke volumes to those trained to read it. She did not know his people maintained a precarious camp in the willows beside the sluggish river, a temporary arrangement that kept bellies marginally full, but offered absolutely zero security or permanence. She did not know Maka inhabited the treacherous, painful territory between worlds tolerated by soldiers who desperately needed his superior tracking skills, but regarded with deep suspicion by some of his own people, who viewed his acceptance of blue-coat wages as collaboration with their mortal enemies. But she would learn all of this and considerably more, because 3 days after the terrifying wagon incident, Antonin Pike decided to stage what he grandly called a hiring fair in the center of town. The rough platform materialized in the middle of the dusty street like a gallows waiting patiently for its next grim appointment. Pike's hired men had constructed it early that morning, hammering nails and shouting contradictory instructions while the sun climbed steadily, and yesterday's disturbed dust began its slow, inevitable descent back to earth. By noon, a substantial crowd had gathered with the sad inevitability of vultures spotting fresh carrion miners still wearing the hill's orange dirt like a second-skin ranch hands, with grime embedded so permanently under their nails it had become part of them. Townsmen in sweat-stained vests and broad-brimmed hats, all drawn irresistibly by the promise of something novel to purchase or at least observe as entertainment. Adelaide stood on that rough stage of warped planks laid across empty barrels, flanked by the silent Liza and another woman named Ruth, who trembled visibly. Their wrists were bound together with coarse hemp that abraded skin with every slight movement or breath. The merciless sun beat down with what felt like personal malice. Below the platform, men milled and muttered amongst themselves, craning their necks to scrutinize the human merchandise on display. Pike positioned himself prominently to one side, hands resting with deceptive casualness in his pockets, smiling with the beneficent warmth of a revival preacher about to save lost souls and collect their money. "Gentlemen," he announced in a voice trained to carry across rowdy crowds, "I present to you a truly remarkable opportunity for your consideration. These women represent highly skilled labor-experienced cooks, competent washers, and trained midwives with documented success. Their labor contracts are now available for transfer to responsible parties, providing you with absolutely reliable assistance for your homes and various commercial enterprises." Adelaide's stomach clenched painfully. Pike was not technically selling them outright as slaves. The war had legally ended that particular brutal institution, but he was systematically selling their labor, their time, their bodies, in every meaningful sense that actually mattered. The legal distinction possessed all the substance of morning mist burning away under the sun. A thick-shouldered man, positioned near the front of the crowd, his face flushed dangerously red, from sun or whiskey or both, cupped his calloused hands around his mouth. "How old is that tall one there?" he shouted with the bluntness of someone accustomed to evaluating livestock. 32 years of age, Pike answered with the smooth ease of extensive practice. "Strong as any working ox you will locate anywhere. She has successfully delivered more living infants than I have bothered to tally in my records." Another man, this one wearing a contemptuous sneer like it was a badge of honor, called out loudly, 32. She is likely barren by that advanced age. What earthly good is a barren woman to any man of sense? Harsh laughter rippled through the assembled crowd, low ugly the distinctive sound of men enjoying cruelty as public entertainment. Adelaide felt pure rage ignite in her chest, a heat so sharp and clean it burned away the accumulated fear. She lifted her chin defiantly and spoke with a voice that carried clearly to the crowd's furthest edges. "No one marries a black girl, sir." She said each word crisp and deliberately enunciated so there could be no misunderstanding. "But I can birth babies better than anyone in 3 counties. I have pulled more dying women back from death's door than any preacher's desperate prayer has ever managed in this entire settlement. If you want someone who genuinely knows her trade, rather than merely pretends competence, you will not locate anyone better qualified." Profound silence dropped like a stone into still water. Several men shifted their weight uncomfortably suddenly, unable to meet her direct gaze. Others grinned with appreciation, enjoying her audacity even as they dismissed its source as ultimately irrelevant. But Maka, standing inconspicuously near the rear of the crowd, with 2 Apache cousins whose names Adelaide did not yet know, heard something entirely different in her defiant voice. He heard pride that had somehow survived years of systematic crushing trampling. He heard exhaustion that absolutely refused to become pathetic self-pity. He heard a woman who categorically refused to disappear simply because the world found her existence inconvenient and her humanity uncomfortable to acknowledge. He pushed forward deliberately through the crowd, weaving between bodies until he stood close enough to the platform to be clearly heard by everyone present. "Where I come from," he stated in plain, unaccented English that surprised several listeners who expected broken speech. "You do not sell the skilled hands that bring children safely into this world." Pike's brutal foreman, Haskell, pivoted toward him with the speed of a striking rattlesnake. "Mind your own kind, Indian," he snarled with naked contempt. Maka did not retreat even a single inch. "I am minding my own kind. All of them." Haskell shoved him violently with both hands, hard enough to make most men stumble backward. Maka rocked back on his heels but maintained his careful balance through long practice. One of his cousins stepped forward immediately in solidarity and support. Haskell's hand dropped instinctively toward the pistol riding at his hip. Soldiers positioned strategically near the crowd's periphery began moving inward, purposefully barking sharp orders that the escalating commotion swallowed completely. Someone threw a wild punch. Someone else drew a knife that caught the harsh sunlight with a wicked gleam, drawing gasps. In the resulting explosive chaos, a pistol discharged crack sharp and unmistakable, even amid the shouting and cursing. The bullet splintered the thick post supporting the platform's corner, missing Adelaide's skull by mere inches. Wooden fragments flew like deadly shrapnel. She flinched violently, the rope binding her wrists, jerking painfully against torn skin. Men scattered frantically in every direction, yelling contradictory warnings and threats. Horses reared and screamed in panic. In the swirling confusion, a small leather-bound ledger tumbled from its resting place on a shelf just inside Pike's office door, bounced down the wooden steps, and skidded across the churned, dusty earth. It flopped open at Adelaide's feet, yellowed pages fluttering weakly in the hot breeze. She glimpsed names inscribed in cramped, hurried handwriting. Dollar amounts. Dates. Destinations that meant absolutely nothing to her yet, but clearly meant something vitally important to someone. Instinct seized complete control. She crouched low, grabbed the ledger awkwardly with her bound hands, and launched herself off the platform without thinking. Her feet struck the hard ground with jarring impact that shot pain up through her knees and spine. She ran without any clear destination, simply away from the chaos, away from Pike, away from the rope and the platform and the leering faces. Behind her, Pike's enraged roar cut through the confusion like a blade. Retrieve that woman immediately. Do not let her escape. Two of his hired riders spurred their mounts violently through the scattering crowd, iron-shod hooves throwing up divots of hard-packed dirt. Adelaide darted desperately into the narrow gap between the saloon's weathered side wall and the livery stable, her heart hammering so hard, each beat felt like it might crack a rib. Hooves pounded behind her with terrifying closeness. A bullet cracked past her ear and punched a ragged hole in the wall beside her head. Sharp splinters stung her cheek like angry wasp stings. She did not waste precious time looking back to assess pursuit. She simply ran faster, clutching the stolen ledger tightly against her chest, as if it contained salvation itself. The alley between the livery stable and the telegraph office was barely wide enough for a horse and rider to navigate single file without scraping against walls. Adelaide sprinted down its length at full speed, her worn boots slipping treacherously on loose gravel and scattered straw. Behind her, Pike's riders cursed with impressive creativity and hauled brutally on their reins, forcing reluctant mounts to squeeze through the confined space. A large water barrel stood like a sentinel near the telegraph office's rear wall, iron-banded and filled nearly to its brim with precious liquid. Adelaide dodged around it with only inches to spare. One of the pursuing riders raised his pistol reflexively and fired without careful aim. The bullet punched through the barrel's thick wooden side with a sound like a fist striking a ripe melon. Water exploded outward in a powerful gushing torrent, instantly transforming the packed dirt into treacherous slick mud. Adelaide's boots skidded out from under her without warning. She went down hard, slamming into the cold muck with breath-stealing force that left her gasping. The precious ledger flew from her hands, skidding across the slippery ground, directly toward the nearest horse's iron-shod hooves. The rider leaned eagerly from his saddle, his arm extending to claim the valuable prize. Maka materialized at the alley's mouth as if the swirling dust had suddenly taken human form and decided to intervene in mortal affairs. He moved with startling predatory speed, faster than Adelaide would have believed possible for someone his size, and hurled himself shoulder first into the horse's broad-barreled chest with tremendous force. The surprised animal shrieked in terror and pain, crashing sideways into the solid adobe wall with an impact that shook dust from the rafters. The rider's leg caught viciously between horse and wall bone, crunching with a wet, sickening snap that made Adelaide's stomach turn. He howled in agony and slid from the saddle, crumpling uselessly in the mud. Maka snatched up the muddy ledger with his left hand, in one smooth motion grabbed Adelaide's bound wrists firmly with his right, and hauled her bodily upright with surprising gentleness despite the urgency. "Move right now," he commanded tersely, his voice tight with barely controlled urgency. They plunged together through the livery stable's dim, hay-scented interior, dodging startled horses that rolled their eyes and stamped nervously in their stalls. The second rider spurred after them with grim determination, his revolver barking repeatedly. A bullet chewed violently into a wooden support post near Maka's head, showering them both with stinging splinters. He ducked low, pulling Adelaide down protectively with him, and they burst out the stable's far side into open ground that stretched endlessly toward the distant river. The river lay perhaps 200 yards distant, shallow and sluggish in the late-season heat that had baked the prairie mercilessly for months. Maka did not hesitate or pause to discuss alternatives. He dragged Adelaide directly into the water-cold liquid, slapping their thighs with shocking intensity that stole breath. Smooth stones turned treacherous, underfoot covered in slick algae. The second rider followed with single-minded determination, his horse floundering awkwardly in thick mud near the bank. He fired wildly and repeatedly. A bullet churned the water mere inches from Adelaide's hip, close enough that she felt the spray against her skin and fabric. Maka shoved the precious ledger deep into a hollow beneath an old tree root on the far bank, a natural cavity undercut by years of persistent current, and frantically jammed wet sand over it with his bare hands. "Stay low and do not move," he ordered through clenched teeth. Dr. Edmund appeared suddenly at the top of the bank, as if summoned by Providence itself, his water barrels completely forgotten in his wagon bed. He had been filling containers upstream when the shooting erupted like thunder. Now he abandoned his task entirely and scrambled down the steep bank, extending both hands to haul the dripping fugitives up to relative safety. Sheriff McCready arrived moments later, breathing hard from unaccustomed physical exertion, his pistol drawn with authority he rarely needed to actually deploy in this normally quiet town. Pike stood exactly 3 paces behind him, his fleshy face flushed dangerously crimson with barely contained fury. "Where is my stolen property, Sheriff?" Pike demanded with forced calm. Maka said absolutely nothing. Adelaide remained equally silent, her jaw set. McCready's calculating gaze flicked between them, then settled on Edmund with assessment. "Doctor," he said with deceptive mildness that fooled no one, "are you deliberately interfering with lawful business operations?" "I am preventing what would clearly become a murder," Edmund stated flatly, meeting the sheriff's eyes without flinching, even slightly. "Nobody's murdering anyone here today." Pike stepped forward deliberately, forcing artificial calm into his voice with visible effort and imperfect success. "That ledger contains confidential business records of significant value. Theft represents a serious criminal offense under territorial law, Sheriff McCready. I trust you will execute your duties appropriately and recover my property." McCready nodded slowly, calculation clearly visible behind his watery eyes. "I will personally secure the evidence. Keep it absolutely safe pending proper legal investigation." Edmund's jaw tightened visibly, but he possessed sufficient hard-won wisdom to recognize a battle he could not possibly win in this particular moment. Pike's cold gaze lingered on Maka, with predatory assessment, and then shifted deliberately to Adelaide, with an expression that promised severe consequences. "You have made a profoundly serious error in judgment, girl," he said softly, each word precisely and deliberately articulated for maximum effect. Then he turned on his heel with military precision and walked back toward town, Sheriff McCready trailing obediently in his wake like a well-trained dog. Adelaide stood dripping on the muddy riverbank, her entire body shaking uncontrollably with combined adrenaline and cold. Maka watched Pike's retreating figure with an expression that revealed absolutely nothing of his thoughts. "Thank you." Adelaide finally managed her voice, emerging rough and unsteady. Maka glanced at her briefly. "Do not thank me yet. This situation is very far from concluded." Maka understood with absolute clarity that he could not simply march Adelaide back to town and expect any kind of justice. Pike would construct whatever self-serving narrative suited his purposes, theft, assault, criminal conspiracy, and Adelaide would hang from a rope by week's end or disappear into circumstances considerably worse than clean hanging. And if Maka simply walked away to protect himself, she would inevitably run. Running alone across open prairie, without adequate supplies or detailed geographic knowledge, was tantamount to slow suicide by exposure or thirst or any of a dozen other patient killers that haunted the endless grasslands waiting for the foolish and desperate. So he led her, still half-drenched and trembling with shock and cold, along the river's meandering course toward the place where his people maintained their temporary precarious encampment. The Apache band had established themselves in a thick stand of willows near a pronounced bend in the slow-moving water, positioned far enough from Coyote Springs to avoid constant friction and harassment, but close enough to trade sporadically for flour and ammunition at the fort when circumstances required. Smoke from cooking fires mingled with the pleasant scent of willow leaves and damp river mud. Women paused in their daily tasks to observe Mahka's approach with narrowed eyes, their expressions growing distinctly concerned when they noticed his unexpected companion. Tarak, one of the band's senior and most respected members, stepped forward with the unhurried authority of age and hard-won wisdom. "You bring trouble directly to our camp," he observed in Apache, his tone making it clear statement rather than uncertain question. "She saved her own life by taking evidence of crimes." Mahka responded in the same language, meeting the elder's eyes respectfully, but without submission. "Pike would have killed her for witnessing what she witnessed and taking what she took. Pike will come searching for her. You know this with certainty. Then we relocate the camp if that becomes necessary. We have moved before." Tarak shook his graying head with the profound weariness of a man who has had this same argument too many times across too many years. "You think like someone with absolutely nothing left to lose, nephew. But we have vulnerable children here, elders who cannot ride hard or fast. The soldiers will use any excuse you provide them to justify what they already want to do." Mahka opened his mouth to argue the point further, but a scream cut him off, sharp, ragged, desperate, with unbearable pain. It originated from the far side of the encampment, from the wiki-up, where his younger sister Onawa had been laboring in increasingly difficult childbirth for the past day and a half. Adelaide heard that agonized scream and moved before conscious thought fully engaged. She ran toward the terrible sound on pure instinct, the same way she had run toward difficult births in sod huts and lean-tos across 3 hard counties. Mahka followed close behind, pushing through the worried cluster of women gathered anxiously outside the wiki-up's low entrance. Inside the dim structure, Onawa lay on blankets soaked completely through with sweat that smelled sharply of fear and utter exhaustion. The band's regular midwife knelt beside her, an elderly woman whose gnarled hands trembled visibly with fatigue. "She's been laboring since yesterday evening," the midwife explained in halting, heavily accented English when she noticed Adelaide. "The baby will not come. It is badly stuck." Adelaide knelt immediately without requesting permission or waiting for formal invitation. She washed her hands quickly in a clay bowl of water someone thrust toward her, tied up her skirt to keep it clear of the work, and conducted a swift but thorough examination. The infant was lodged dangerously, shoulders wedged at an angle that prevented any descent, umbilical cord pulled dangerously taut. If the baby did not emerge very soon, both mother and child would die. Possibly within the hour, certainly within 2. Rain began outside without warning, fat drops drumming against the wiki-up's hide, covering with increasing intensity. Inside, the already close air turned thick and oppressive. Adelaide worked with the steady, practiced focus she had developed across hundreds of difficult deliveries, her skilled hands reading the complicated situation through touch alone. She spoke softly to Onawa in a voice that transcended specific language through pure tone and evident compassion. "I know the pain feels impossible to bear. I know you are exhausted beyond anything you thought possible. But you possess strength you have not yet accessed. We will do this together, you and I." Onawa sobbed brokenly, gripping Adelaide's wrist with crushing force that would leave spectacular bruises. Adelaide did not flinch or pull away. She simply continued her careful work, pressing gently here, adjusting angle there with minute precision, coaxing the stubborn infant millimeter by patient millimeter toward proper position. Mahka braced his sister's shoulders firmly to prevent her from thrashing violently and causing injury to herself or the struggling child. At one critical moment, The main roof pole slipped dangerously from its mooring and nearly cracked Onawa's skull open like an egg. Maka caught it reflexively with his forearm, rough bark scraping away skin and drawing blood, and held it steady in position until someone could properly prop it. When the infant finally slid into Adelaide's waiting hands, slick with blood and protective vernix, the child was utterly terrifyingly silent. No cry, no movement, no breath. Everyone crowded in the wiki-up held their collective breath in agonizing suspension. Adelaide rubbed the tiny back with practiced vigor, cleared the mouth and nose carefully with her finger, and waited through what felt like an eternity, compressed impossibly into mere seconds. Then the baby released a fierce, furious wail of protest at being born into a world of rain and struggle. Onawa sobbed with relief, so profound and overwhelming, it sounded remarkably like grief transformed into joy. Maka's knees very nearly buckled beneath him. The elderly midwife whispered a fervent prayer to spirits Adelaide did not know by name, but recognized instantly by their essential function. Adelaide, breathing hard from exertion, wrapped the squalling infant in the cleanest available blanket and placed the child carefully on Onawa's heaving chest. "You owe me a clean blanket and a hot drink when you have recovered your strength," she said, her voice rough with exhaustion, but warm with satisfaction. It was delivered half as jest, half as serious declaration. Not servitude. Earned respect. Onawa smiled through her tears, one trembling hand cradling her newborn daughter. "You will have both and considerably more besides. You have my word." Later that evening, as Onawa slept deeply and the baby nursed contentedly, Adelaide sat outside the wiki-up with Maka. They shared dried meat and water in comfortable silence for a time. Then, without planning to, Adelaide began speaking about her past, about her grandmother, who had taught her the mysteries of bringing life into the world, about the plantation where she had been born into bondage, about the day Union soldiers arrived, and spoke words about freedom that seemed too impossible to believe, about journeying west with hope that curdled slowly into this new form of captivity under Pike's system. Maka listened without interruption. Then he spoke quietly about his own losses, about band members killed in raids, about treaties broken before the ink dried, about being pushed steadily from ancestral lands into smaller and smaller territories, about choosing to work for the army because it kept his people fed even as it slowly killed something essential in his spirit. They did not touch. They did not make promises. But understanding passed between them, recognition of shared pain and shared determination, not to simply disappear to satisfy others' convenience. Back in Coyote Springs, Pike raged with the uncontrolled fury of a man utterly unaccustomed to having his will thwarted by those he considered beneath consideration. He paced his office above the saloon, knocking over a chair with deliberate violence, slamming his meaty fist against the desk hard enough to rattle the inkwell and scatter important papers. Quincy stood near the door with hands shoved deep in his pockets, offering absolutely no commentary. "Well, that cursed Indian and that damned woman made me look like a complete fool in front of the entire town." Pike snarled, punctuating his words with another violent blow to the desk. "I want them located immediately. I want my ledger recovered intact. I want this infuriating situation resolved permanently." Quincy nodded with careful, studied neutrality. "What specific actions do you want me to undertake?" "Discover who took the ledger. Discover where the woman fled. And if anyone attempts to obstruct you in any way, you deal with them using whatever methods prove necessary. I do not care about the details." Quincy departed without further discussion, but Adelaide later learned that he bore fresh bruises on his ribs that had not been present earlier, evidence that Pike's temper had found a closer target first. As Quincy walked down the street toward the Red Cattle Saloon, Captain Cole materialized beside him with the uncanny timing that made soldiers whisper about unnatural prescience. "Experiencing difficulties?" Cole inquired mildly, his tone carefully casual. That depends entirely, Quincy replied with equal care. Are you planning to provide assistance, or are you planning to make everything substantially worse than it already is? Cole smiled with all the genuine warmth of a blade catching lamplight. I am simply planning to execute my assigned duties with appropriate diligence, maintaining peace in this territory, ensuring the Apache do not create problems for law-abiding settlers pursuing legitimate prosperity. Quincy halted mid-stride and regarded the captain with sudden complete understanding. You want them to create problems, don't you? You need them to. Cole's smile never wavered. I want them to provide me with sufficient justification to relocate them to appropriate reservation lands where they can be properly supervised. Pike's activities are pushing them systematically toward a breaking point. When they inevitably push back, and they will push back eventually, because they always do, I will possess the full authorization to finish what should have been properly concluded years ago. Final answers to troubles that never seem to end. Quincy stared at him for a long, heavy moment of assessment. Then he spat deliberately in the dirt between them and walked away, without another word, his contempt clear. 3 nights later, Maka slipped back into Coyote Springs under cover of darkness with Adelaide cloaked and hooded beside him. They moved through shadows behind the telegraph office, where Quincy waited nervously smoking a cigarette that glowed like a lonely firefly in the darkness. Maka grabbed him without preamble or warning and pressed him firmly against the rough adobe wall knife point, resting against his throat with just enough pressure to communicate absolute seriousness. Where does Pike keep the actual ledger? Maka demanded flatly. The complete record's not the small decoy book I recovered. Quincy, shaking despite obvious efforts to maintain composure, whispered urgently through his fear. The small one was essentially meaningless window dressing. Pike maintains the genuine records at the mine itself. Iron cash box in the main office, locked with a good lock, 2 armed guards on constant rotation. Who else possesses this knowledge? Quincy hesitated visibly, and Maka increased the knife pressure fractionally. The gambler gasped. Cole. Captain Cole knows everything. Pike compensates him generously to ignore the labor contract violations and the disappearances. But it runs considerably deeper than simple bribery. Cole actively wants trouble. He desperately needs violence to justify a full military campaign against the Apache. Your people, her people, you are all just pieces on his strategic game board. Maka's hand tightened on the knife handle. You are absolutely certain of this intelligence. I heard them conspiring directly. Quincy said, words tumbling out rapidly. 2 nights ago in Pike's private office, Cole stated explicitly that he needed a provocation, said he was considering killing a few Apache himself and staging it to appear they attacked settlers first. Create the justification he requires for extermination orders. He already did it once as a test. Maka went very still. What do you mean he already did it once? 3 weeks ago, a young Apache man went missing. Your people thought he ran off or got killed in an accident. Cole told Pike he shot him and left the body where it would not be found just to see if anyone suspected. Nobody did. So now he is planning something larger. This was worse than Maka had imagined. Not just exploitation and bribery, but premeditated murder to manufacture war. That same night, following fragmentary information Quincy had reluctantly provided, Maka and Adelaide discovered a second body at the creek flowing below Widow's Peak mine. A young black woman, perhaps 17 years old at most, lay partially submerged in shallow water that ran clear over her lifeless face. Deep rope burns circled both wrists like obscene bracelets. Her bare feet bore the distinctive orange staining of mine tailings and processing chemicals used in gold extraction. The creek carried the acrid metallic reek of poisoned water from the mine. Adelaide knelt beside the body, her hands trembling violently, despite desperate efforts to steady them. "I knew this girl," she whispered, her voice breaking completely. "I treated her for fever 3 months ago. She told me she was carefully saving money to buy out her contract and go to California. She was—" Adelaide's voice fractured entirely. She was only a child with dreams of something better than this. Maka stood in grim silence, his jaw clenched so tightly that muscles jumped visibly beneath skin. This was not random frontier violence. This represented a systematic pattern of exploitation and casual disposal of human beings deemed inconvenient or unprofitable. Now he comprehended the full trap surrounding them from all sides. If he helped expose Pike's criminal operation, Cole would lose his carefully orchestrated pretext for war and might retaliate directly and violently against the Apache encampment in cold retribution. If Maka backed away to protect his people through inaction, more women would end up floating dead in this poisoned creek, their modest dreams dissolving like morning fog under harsh sun. Later, sitting beside the river with his 2 cousins, while countless stars wheeled overhead in ancient patterns, Maka articulated his painful decision. If we remain silent, we become accomplices to ongoing murder. If we fight openly, Cole may attack the camp regardless, using our resistance as his excuse. But I would rather die giving him a reason he did not manufacture from complete lies. That night, they gathered their few possessions and left their Army-issued equipment, bedrolls, canteens, even the blue identification badges that granted them marginal protection in a deliberate pile outside the fort gates. They did not look back. Over the next several days, Adelaide and Dr. Edmund worked quietly and carefully to gather testimony from people too frightened to speak publicly. A ranch hand remembered seeing an unusual wagon departing the mine well after midnight, carrying something bulky wrapped in canvas that dripped dark liquid in the moonlight. A washerwoman employed at the Red Cattle Saloon recalled a cheerful young woman who had vanished abruptly after Pike purchased her contract from a previous holder. A stable boy with acute hearing had overheard Pike arguing with Haskell about eliminating loose ends that asked too many questions about what happened to the others. None of it constituted legal proof by any courtroom standard. But collectively, it formed an unmistakable damning pattern of deliberate predation. Then Quincy brought them evidence that transformed vague suspicion into actionable intelligence. He appeared at Edmund's office well after midnight, sporting fresh bruises on his face and bleeding from a split lip that had clearly not been there hours earlier. "I found something significant," he announced thickly through swollen tissues. He extracted a folded document from inside his coat, a telegraph receipt bearing official stamps and multiple signatures. The text listed names, dates, and substantial monetary amounts. One name stood out with damning clarity: Captain Abram Cole, recipient of $500, the payment marked euphemistically as consultation fee for services rendered. "He has been accepting substantial bribes for many months," Quincy explained painfully. "Pike pays him to ignore labor contract violations, to overlook disappearances, to provide military cover for criminal operations. But the conspiracy goes much deeper than simple corruption. Cole actively wants violence. He desperately requires bloodshed to justify a comprehensive campaign against the Apache." Quincy paused and then added the most damning detail. "He has already killed at least one of your people, Maka, and staged it to look like an accident. He told Pike it was a successful test. Now he is planning something much larger, maybe a raid on your camp, that he will claim was Apache aggression against innocent settlers." Adelaide stared at the incriminating receipt, nausea twisting her stomach into painful knots. "We are all just tools to him. Black Apache, poor whites, none of us matter as actual human beings. We are merely convenient excuses for his career advancement." Edmund folded the telegraph receipt with meticulous care. "This directly connects Cole to Pike's criminal enterprise. Combined with the mine ledgers documenting actual transactions, we would possess sufficient evidence to summon federal marshals and possibly army officers sent from outside the territory. Pike secures those ledgers in an iron box at the mine office, Quincy added. 2 guards maintain constant watch in rotating shifts. But I know their schedule. There is a window of opportunity during shift change. Maka, who had been standing motionless by the window, staring into darkness, turned to face them. Then we take the ledgers by force if necessary. We have no other options remaining. That course of action will almost certainly get you killed, Edmund stated flatly. Better than waiting passively for Cole to murder us systematically while we do nothing. The small room fell into heavy, oppressive silence. Outside, wind rattled the shutters with skeletal fingers. Finally, Adelaide spoke with quiet but unmistakable intensity. If we undertake this action, we must execute it perfectly. No more running. No more hiding like frightened rabbits from wolves. We acquire those ledgers, and we ensure everyone in the territory sees the evidence clearly. We expose them completely and publicly. Maka nodded slowly. Agreed. We move. A sharp knock at the door interrupted his planning. Everyone froze instantly. Edmund approached cautiously and opened the door just a crack. A frightened Apache boy no more than 12 years old stood trembling in the darkness. Maka. The boy gasped in Apache, his words tumbling over each other. Soldiers came to the camp at sunset. They took 3 of our men. Captain Cole says they stole army horses. Everyone knows it is a complete lie. He is taking them to the fort stockade. This was it, Cole's manufactured provocation beginning to unfold exactly as planned. Maka's hands curled into tight fists. When did this occur? 2 hours ago. They are holding them in the stockade. People are saying Cole plans to hang them tomorrow to make an example that will terrify everyone. Maka looked at Adelaide, then at Edmund, then back at the frightened boy. The trap was closing faster than they had anticipated. They had run out of time for careful planning. We go tonight, Maka said with finality. We retrieve the ledgers and deliver them to the territorial marshal before Cole can execute his plan. It represents our only remaining option. But even as they prepared in desperate haste, none of them realized that Pike had already set his own counter-move in motion, and that Quincy's bruises told a story about betrayal that none of them had yet fully understood. Pike did not waste precious energy on legal proceedings or wait patiently for official warrants. Instead, he rallied a vigilante mob with the practiced efficiency of extensive experienced ranch hands, nursing old grudges and new desperation miners, eager for violence as entertainment and distraction from their miserable lives. Drifters attracted by promised bounty money they desperately needed. He positioned himself prominently in Coyote Springs' dusty main street and called them to righteous action with practiced oratory, waving a hastily prepared warrant bearing Sheriff McCready's obliging signature. The warrant accused Adelaide of murdering the young woman found in the creek and named Maka as her criminal accomplice and co-conspirator. The dead girl herself served as proof Pike declared with theatrical sorrow that fooled absolutely no one who knew him of their savage and utterly depraved violence against innocent victims. It was a lie so audacious and brazen, it momentarily stole Adelaide's breath when she heard about it through Edmund's urgent warning. But lies did not require truth as foundation. They merely needed sufficient volume, aggressive repetition, and an audience predisposed to believe them. Dr. Edmund and William Briggs, a wheat farmer, perpetually one failed harvest away from complete destitution, smuggled Adelaide out of town concealed in a hay cart. They transported her carefully to William's modest farmhouse, a weathered structure that had endured too many brutal seasons, and showed every single one of them. Weathered boards that had once been painted. Floorboards that creaked ominously underfoot. a small loft that smelled of stored grain and mice nests. William's wife, Martha, a thin woman worn down by relentless childbearing and endless prairie wind, still vividly remembered Adelaide's skilled hands pulling her back from death's grasping precipice during a hemorrhaging birth 2 years previous. She refused categorically to turn Adelaide away, regardless of consequences to herself and her children. But concealing her represented terrible risk. If the posse discovered Adelaide's location, they would burn the farm to ashes with the family potentially still inside as an example to others. One evening near dusk, Adelaide slipped away from the farmhouse toward the edge of William's wheat field, seriously contemplating solitary flight into the unknown. The wheat stood tall and golden in the fading light, heavy heads swaying in the endless wind. She possessed only fragmentary knowledge of the surrounding geography. Becoming lost in this vast emptiness could kill her as surely as Pike's rope, but perhaps more mercifully. But remaining here might doom William's entire family to fiery death. William limped after her, his gait still seriously compromised from a plow accident that had nearly shattered his leg months earlier. "You walk off alone now," he warned without preamble, his voice rough with concern. "They will track you down on open ground within hours. You will not survive even one full day out there." She spun to face him, accumulated bitterness and rage spilling out in equal measure. "I appreciate what you are risking truly, but history teaches hard lessons. People hide us when it is convenient, when it costs them little. But nobody stands beside us when the actual shooting begins. Nobody willingly risks their own children for us." Rustling wheat answered her passionate words, but the sound came from the wrong direction, not from William. Maka emerged from the golden stalks, with his 2 cousins arrayed behind him, their silhouettes stark and dramatic against the crimson sunset. He had been tracking the posse's movements for the past day and a half, reading their trail in broken grass and horse droppings, circling carefully ahead to position himself between them and Adelaide. He did not deliver a grand speech or make dramatic declarations. He simply moved to stand directly at her side, his eyes fixed on the distant road where dust marked approaching riders. "You are not alone anymore," he said quietly, but with absolute conviction. "That time has passed. We stand together now, or we fall together. But you are not alone." A moment later, 2 posse scouts materialized on the ridge to the east, their figures silhouetted sharply against the dying sun. Maka grabbed Adelaide's sleeve and pulled her down into the wheat with urgent force. They pressed themselves flat against earth still warm from the day's accumulated heat, sharing the harsh rasp of each other's labored breathing as horse hooves drummed past with terrible proximity, close enough to hear leather creaking, close enough to smell horse sweat, and unwashed riders close enough to die if spotted. She could feel Maka's heartbeat, where her shoulder pressed against his chest, hammering rapidly in rhythm with her own racing pulse. When the riders finally passed beyond hearing, he did not immediately move away. Instead, he stayed close, his head turned toward hers in the deepening twilight, dark eyes searching her face with an intensity that had nothing to do with tactical assessment. "If we survive what is coming," he said softly, "I am not walking away from you. I want that understood clearly between us." Adelaide swallowed against sudden tightness in her throat. "You should walk away. You should take your people far from here and forget you ever saw me on that road." "I will not do that. I cannot do that now." It was the most intimate moment they had yet shared. Not a kiss stolen in moonlight, not flowery declarations of undying devotion. Just 2 hearts beating too fast in the same small patch of trampled earth, while death rode past mere yards away, and the profound recognition that they had become absolutely essential to each other's continued survival, and something more that neither was yet ready to name. Pike's mob swelled like a malignant growth, feeding on fear and hatred. By the following morning, Dozens of armed men on horseback assembled outside Coyote Springs, rifles, torches, coiled ropes, righteous fury stoked by whiskey and pike silver, and the permission to unleash violence without consequence. They rode first to the Apache encampment beside the river, found it strategically abandoned, and turned their horses toward William's farm with the grim inevitability of a prairie fire following wind. Dr. Edmund had already dispatched a detailed telegraph to the deputy U.S. Marshal stationed in the nearest city, with actual law enforcement, painstakingly copying names and monetary amounts from the incriminating receipts and his own careful notes. But federal assistance would require days to arrive, perhaps a full week, given the distances involved. Tonight they stood alone against overwhelming force. Maka understood with tactical clarity born of hard experience that they could not successfully defend the farmhouse against dozens of armed men. The structure would become a death trap, a burning coffin for everyone inside. So he knelt in the dirt near William's barn and sketched a desperate plan using a stick and stones as improvised tactical markers. Above the farm, Pike maintained a sizable herd of half-wild cattle in a high-pasture animals more accustomed to open range than human management. The herd was contained behind a heavy split-rail fence, the gate secured with thick, braided rawhide rope that had probably been there for years. If they could lure the mob onto the slope directly below that pasture and then cut the rope at precisely the right moment, the resulting stampede might scatter Pike's forces long enough to reach the mine and seize the cash box containing definitive proof of everything. It was desperate to the point of suicidal. The timing would have to be perfect. But they had exhausted all alternatives. Well before dawn, beneath a sky streaked with cold gray clouds that promised rain, before noon, Maka, Adelaide, Onawa, and William began their careful climb up the rocky trail toward the high pasture. Wind clawed at them with spiteful intensity, carrying the smell of distant rain and disturbed earth. Maka's ribs, still badly bruised from previous violent encounters, sent sharp stabbing pain through his torso with each labored step, but he pushed grimly forward without complaint. William carried a covered lantern, its precious flame carefully shielded from the wind. The posse spotted their movement as the first pale light touched the eastern horizon, turning the sky to pearl and rose. Shouts erupted immediately. Riders spurred uphill in aggressive pursuit. Gunfire crackled across the slope, sharp reports echoing off Stone's bullets, whining as they ricocheted. One bullet struck William's lantern and shattered it completely, glass and burning oil spraying across rocks in a fan of flame. Another round slammed into William's thigh with a meaty thud that made Adelaide's stomach lurch, spinning him sideways. His horse stumbled on loose rock, and William fell badly, his mount's weight crushing his lower leg viciously against an unforgiving boulder. Bones snapped with a sound like green wood breaking. William's scream tore across the hillside, raw and animalistic. Adelaide and Onawa threw themselves into the dirt beside him without hesitation, grabbing his arms, hauling with desperate strength to drag his body clear before the panicked horse could trample him further. Blood soaked through William's trousers, rapidly spreading in a dark stain that looked black in the dim light. His face drained to the color of old paper shock, setting in with terrifying speed. His eyes rolled back. Maka raced ahead toward the cattle penknife already drawn, while bullets chewed the ground around him in a continuous, deadly rain. He reached the gate and began sawing frantically at the thick, rawhide knot securing it closed. The cattle behind the fence sensed the chaos and began moving nervously, pressing against the rails with their combined weight, snorting and stamping. A slug screamed past Maka's ear, close enough to feel the heat of its passage, and splintered the top rail into fragments that showered across his back and neck. He hacked desperately through the last twisted strands of stubborn rawhide and swung the heavy gate wide with all his remaining strength. Then he snapped a thick, dead branch across the lead bull's flank with a sharp crack. The startled animal bellowed and charged forward through the opening with singular purpose. The entire herd surged after their leader in an explosion of muscle and horn and primal panic, a living avalanche of beef and terror thundering downhill. The stampede roared downhill directly into the climbing posse with the irresistible force of natural disaster. Horses reared and screamed in abject terror, their eyes rolling white, throwing riders who had absolutely no chance to control them. Men toppled from saddles, some trampled immediately beneath iron-hard hooves, others hurled against unforgiving rocks with bone-breaking force. Gunfire erupted wildly as panicked men shot at anything moving, sometimes hitting their own mounts or companions in the chaos. Quincy, displaying unexpected courage, grabbed one unconscious rider by the collar and dragged him desperately clear of the stampede's path. A steer's hoof caught Quincy's shoulder with devastating force, spinning him completely around. He collapsed hard, clutching his arm, gasping. The mob disintegrated into scattered fragments, men fleeing desperately in every direction to escape the cattle-all organization and purpose abandoned completely in favor of simple survival. But Pike, consumed by rage and the terrible clarity that comes from watching everything collapse, spurred his horse past the worst of the stampede through sheer, reckless will and superior horsemanship. He intercepted Adelaide as she knelt beside William, trying desperately to improvise a tourniquet from torn fabric. Pike leaned from his saddle and grabbed her arm with brutal strength, hauling her bodily onto his horse. He jammed a pistol's cold muzzle hard into her ribs and drove his mount at a gallop toward the old abandoned side tunnel of Widow's Peak Mine, using Adelaide's body as a human shield against any pursuit. Maka, his lungs burning, commandeered William's panicked horse and pursued despite every injury, screaming protest. Quincy, cradling his damaged shoulder, somehow found his own mount and followed grimly, determined to see this through. Inside the abandoned tunnel, lamplight cast grotesque shadows that writhed across sagging wooden support timbers and stone walls, weeping moisture. The air reeked of old blasting powder, rotting wood, and geological darkness that had not seen sun in years. Pike dragged Adelaide deeper into the mountain's gut, pistol pressed against her throat, hard enough to bruise flesh and restrict breathing. "You genuinely believe you can destroy me?" Pike hissed, his breath hot and sour against her ear. "I built this entire settlement from absolute nothing. I own every structure, every contract, every soul who draws breath here. You are absolutely nothing compared to that. Then why do you fear me so profoundly?" Adelaide shot back, her voice steady despite the gun at her throat and the terror coursing through her. Pike's grip tightened painfully, fingers digging into her arm. "I do not fear you, girl. I do not fear any of you insignificant wretches." "You should," Adelaide said quietly. "Because we are not nothing anymore, and you know it." Maka and Quincy closed in from the tunnel entrance, their boots crunching on loose rock and broken timbers. Pike pivoted and fired blindly twice. The first shot went wide of Maka, but punched completely through a primary support beam with a sound like lightning striking. Wood cracked ominously. Dirt and small stones began raining down from above in an accelerating stream. The tunnel groaned, a deep, threatening sound that seemed to come from the mountain's very bones. Then Pike's expression changed, became something vicious and satisfied. "You should have stayed, bought, Quincy," he snarled. "I already killed you once today. Should have finished the job." Quincy staggered, his face going white. "The beating this morning," he gasped, touching his bruised ribs. "You thought you killed me, left me for dead. Should have checked." Pike snarled, raising his pistol again. But Maka could not match Pike's brute physical strength, not in his current battered condition. He used the cramped, uneven ground to his tactical advantage, driving Pike backward against the rough wall, denying him room to leverage his weight effectively. Adelaide rammed an abandoned ore cart with all her strength into Pike's legs, buckling his knees. His pistol skittered across the tunnel floor, metal scraping stone. As Pike lunged desperately for the weapon, Quincy noticed another support beam developing an ominous crack dust streaming from the fracture in an accelerating flow. The entire section of roof was coming down, not an immediate collapse, but inevitable within seconds. In that moment of rough redemption for a wasted life, Quincy threw his own body beneath the failing beam, his back and shoulders taking the crushing weight, straining against tons of earth and stone. "Get her out of here now," he shouted through clenched teeth, his voice breaking with pain. "This is my choice. First real choice I ever made. Go." Maka grabbed Adelaide and shoved her toward a narrow ventilation shaft he had spotted earlier during his brief survey, a crack in the rock barely wide enough for a human body. They scrambled through the opening sharp stone, scraping their backs and arms savagely, just as the beam gave way, with a crack like thunder. The ceiling came down in a roaring avalanche of rock and timber and crushing darkness. Pike's scream cut off with terrible abruptness, silenced by geological weight. Quincy vanished beneath the collapse, no final words, no dramatic redemption speech, only crushed wood, and the finality of stone ending everything. Outside, the remnants of the shattered posse stumbled in various states of injury and shock. Some men lay moaning with broken limbs, twisted at unnatural angles. Others sat dazed in trampled grass, weapons forgotten or abandoned, staring at nothing with the hollow eyes of men who had glimpsed their own mortality and found it wanting. Dr. Edmund arrived with a small group of Apache warriors led by Maka's cousins, having trailed the mob from below, waiting for the right moment to intervene. They brought with them the iron cash box seized from the main mine office during the chaos and the earlier telegraph receipts documenting bribes and conspiracy. Hard proof names written in permanent ink dates that could be verified, Cole's signature on multiple documents, Pike's meticulous records of human trafficking disguised as legal labor contracts. The mob had no fight remaining. Several men, suddenly comprehending how close they had come to dying for Pike's greed and lies, threw their rifles into the dirt with expressions of disgust and self-loathing. Sheriff McCready attempted to bluster his way back to authority, but when Edmund stood on a wagon bed and read aloud a contract showing McCready's own secret payments from Pike, the crowd turned on him with the swift cruelty of betrayed dogs. Adelaide knelt beside William, who had been carefully moved to shade. His leg was badly broken, but she could save it with proper splinting and rest. She worked quickly, tearing fabric, setting bone, talking to him constantly to keep him conscious and focused. Maka stood nearby, ribs, screaming, watching Adelaide work. In that moment, seeing her capable hands saving yet another life, he understood that she was not someone who needed rescuing. She was someone worth standing beside. Digging a rescue shaft into the collapsed section of hillside required hours of dangerous work. Men who had been enemies that morning labored side by side with shovels and pry bars, united by the desperate hope of pulling survivors from the rubble. When daylight finally spilled into the small pocket where Maka and Adelaide had sheltered, they were discovered sitting shoulder to shoulder against the stone wall, hands torn and bloodied from clawing uselessly at rock-breathing air, thick with dust that turned each inhalation into agony. Maka's side wound from Pike's earlier shot had soaked his entire shirt in blood. Adelaide's fingers were stripped raw, several nails torn completely away. But they were breathing. They were alive. Rescuers helped them out into blessed daylight, both of them blinking against the sun like creatures emerging from years of darkness rather than hours. Adelaide immediately turned to William, checking his splint, adjusting it despite her own injuries. Pike's body was extracted from the deeper chamber, much later crushed beyond any hope of recognition by several tons of stone and timber. Quincy's remains were found near the splintered beam, his spine bent at an angle incompatible with life. His hands still curved, as if bearing impossible weight in his final seconds. His last choice said more about his character than the preceding 30 years of moral drift and cowardice. Captain Cole was removed from command 3 days later, when the deputy U.S. Marshal finally arrived and examined Pike's ledgers bearing Cole's approving initials and signature on page after damning page. Cole's carefully orchestrated plan for a justified campaign died under cold ink and sworn statements from multiple witnesses. He was escorted from the territory under armed guard, facing court-martial and probable lengthy imprisonment for conspiracy bribery and suspicion of murder. William's leg healed crookedly over the following months, leaving him with a permanent limp, but he kept the limb when amputation had seemed inevitable. Adelaide supervised his recovery with fierce attention, cursing at him gently whenever he attempted to walk too soon against her explicit medical orders. The posse's most violent members nursed broken bones and lived with the uncomfortable knowledge that they had nearly died as tools of a man who viewed them as utterly disposable. Maka's relationship with his band transformed in complex ways. He would never again work for the army or accept their wages or their false promises, and the soldiers would not trust him regardless. But his people recognized that by standing alongside a black woman and a handful of poor white farmers, he had potentially prevented a war that would have devastated everyone in the valley. Resolution and final surprise. Several months later, as autumn transformed the endless prairie into shades of gold and amber, Widow's Peak Mine stood shuttered and silent, its equipment sold at court-ordered auction to pay damages and restitution to identified victims. Pike's various properties were thrown onto the market, attracting speculators and businessmen from neighboring territories who saw opportunity hiding within the chaos and tragedy. Dr. Edmund, having received a modest financial reward for his crucial testimony and his share of funds recovered from Pike's hidden accounts, quietly purchased a worn section of Pike's former ranch holdings. The parcel included William's small farm and the creek where the murdered women had been discovered and recovered. To casual observers, it appeared to be nothing more than a doctor making a sensible property investment for his retirement. One evening during harvest season, with wheat standing tall and ready for cutting, the air thick with floating chaff and the rich smell of ripe grain, Maka rode up to William's farmhouse on a sturdy pony. Adelaide was working in the field alongside William's children, demonstrating to a neighbor woman the proper technique for carrying an infant securely while simultaneously harvesting wheat without straining one's back. Her dress was simple but clean and well-maintained. Her hands moved with the quiet confidence of someone who has earned genuine respect through undeniable competence rather than formal authority. Dr. Edmund arrived shortly after, carrying a leather satchel worn soft from years of hard use. Inside rested not a formal deed bearing Adelaide and Maka's names. As legal owners, such a document would never survive challenge before any judge in the territory, but rather a carefully drafted private contract and Edmund's meticulously prepared last will and testament. The contract granted Adelaide and Maka lifelong right to occupy and farm the land, with explicit legal instructions that upon Edmund's eventual death, the property was to be sold and all proceeds transferred directly to them or their designated heirs. Edmund had also arranged for William to hold nominal legal title while they lived there, providing protective cover against those who would violently object to a black woman and an Apache man claiming land ownership outright. It was a quiet legal trick, exactly the kind of careful workaround that people used throughout that harsh era when the law steadfastly refused to acknowledge their fundamental humanity or rights. Standing among the wheat rows with dusk settling like a gentle blanket, Edmund explained the arrangement in clear, plain language that required no legal training to comprehend. There was no swelling orchestral music, no gathered crowd of well-wishers applauding. Just a doctor with ink stains permanently embedded under his fingernails, handing over a future that might not withstand a determined mob, but would likely survive in court with proper legal representation. Adelaide's eyes filled with tears. She immediately blinked back, having witnessed too much betrayal and loss to trust paper alone. She looked questioningly at Maka, searching his face. "This binds you to this specific place," she said carefully, her voice soft. "To my troubles and my people's troubles, and everything that comes with that. You could still find your people live somewhere else entirely without these complications. Me or Maka, his ribs still painfully stiff in cold weather, accepted the pen from Edmund with careful, deliberate fingers. Your troubles became entangled with mine the moment I pulled you from that wagon. This paper simply allows us to plant crops and build something without constantly waiting for someone else's arbitrary mercy or violence to destroy it. He signed with slow precision, his handwriting careful. She signed beside his name, her signature slightly more practiced. Their names looked small on the legal document, almost insignificant, but utterly real. William clapped Maka on the shoulder with rough affection. Martha embraced Adelaide hard enough to hurt tears streaming down her weathered face. Edmund carefully folded the contract into his satchel and departed without ceremony or expectation of gratitude, satisfied that he had done what justice demanded. Later, as the last golden light painted the wheat field in bronze and amber, Adelaide and Maka walked together along the edge of their shared ground, inspecting what would soon be theirs in every meaningful sense. She adjusted the collar of his worn shirt, where rough fabric had rubbed a half-healed scar raw. He steadied her when a sudden stab of pain from her still-healing ribs made her breath catch sharply. They did not speak of love in the abstract, or make grand declarations about eternal devotion. Instead, they discussed practical matters with the easy comfort of two people who had earned the right to plan a future together. Fences that required mending before winter, simple split rails, not expensive wire they could not afford. Which section of creek might prove safest for children to play in, eventually. Where to position a small house that would withstand prairie wind and provide shelter for a growing family. Maka spoke quietly about his people's traditional relationship with land, not ownership in the white man's possessive sense, but belonging that flowed in both directions. The earth does not belong to us, he explained, his voice thoughtful. We belong to the earth. This piece of ground, though, perhaps we can belong to each other here. Build something that matters, something that lasts beyond us. Adelaide looked at the darkening fields, at the distant farmhouse, with lamplight beginning to glow warmly in its windows, at this man beside her, who had risked everything without being asked and without expectation of reward. I spent my entire life being owned or borrowed or rented like property, she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Never once thought I would stand on ground that might actually be mine. Ours. A place where we belong because we choose it, not because someone permits it. They continued walking, marking out with careful steps where they would build a modest house that would belong to them in every way that truly mattered. Onawa's baby daughter, now 5 months old and thriving, slept peacefully in a cradle inside William's house. The child had been named Ida in Adelaide's honor, though pronounced in the Apache manner. It represented a small bridge between worlds, fragile but real and growing stronger. As darkness gathered completely, they stood together at the edge of their future. And Adelaide spoke about children they might have someday, about building something that would outlast Pike's hatred and Cole's ambition. We will build a good house, Maka said firmly, strong enough to last, and we will fill it with life. Our children will know they belong here. They will know their history, both of our histories, and they will know they are free. Adelaide took his hand, their fingers intertwining. Yes, she said simply. We will. The final image was not a kiss framed against a dramatic sunset, but two figures moving side by side through rows of wheat, already planning the house they would build together. The family they would raise, the future they would create through sheer determination and shared hope. They possessed no guarantee that tomorrow would be kind, no certainty that the world would leave them in peace. But they had each other tested and proven in fire. They had ground beneath their feet that no one could steal without facing a fight. They had a future built on honesty rather than chains, on respect rather than submission. And for the first time in either of their hard-lived lives, that was genuinely enough. More than enough. It was everything.